Alright, so we're back with part 3, and kind of keeping it on that topic of how the environment affects us. They call this the effect. The ability of your surroundings to make you feel or act a certain way. And it really depends on the context of the place. Different places have different effects, right? Church versus school versus home. And the context is definitely complex, but it's a social construction. People build it. There is no genetic code for how you behave at the beach. It isn't like it's written in our genes that you go to the beach and you have a loud, fun time. We learn this, and our societies build this, how you act. So, a great example from the book is how it can change is Avenue Habib, and I'm never going to say that right, Bourguiba in Tunisia. Okay, Tunisia is the capital. I'm sorry, of Tunis. Tunis is the capital city of Tunisia. It was a French colony up until the 1950s. This street was built right through the center of town by the French. Big wide boulevards with trees and lots of wide sidewalks. It was built to resemble Paris. And on this street was built a modern version of a European city. The rest of Tunis had an ancient medieval look with closed, narrow streets, very small, very cramped. This was to be wide and spacious, and it was built basically as a symbol of French colonial power. This is where the best stores were, the best restaurants, the most famous housing. And this is where you went to be seen and be seen. This was in many ways the Michigan Avenue of today. But in the 1950s, when Tunisia became independent, it was renamed after one of the gentlemen who led their independence movement. And in the Arab Spring, because of that connotation, the connection of being a center of power, but also a center of Tunisian identity, the most biggest, loudest protest against the government happened here. Young people went there and they protested because this was where the center of power was seen. So a good example I would say is think about right now in the COVID epidemic and the aftermath of the George Floyd uh, police incident. We're seeing all these protests against racism, Black Lives Matter in the United States. And where are these protests happening? In Chicago, where were the biggest protests happening? Downtown Chicago, in the Loop. Why? Because that is where the center of power in Chicago is. And so to affect that with a protest has much more impact than just doing it, say, in a neighborhood. You can have less people but gain more impact. It's also why it was so important for the Chicago police and the city to maintain order as well, to kind of, and again, keep that view of society. This changes because, the Loop wasn't always that important. It can change over time. Now, human impacts can also affect the physical environment, not just as we perceive it, but we can degrade environments. So some of the major impacts we've had on the green world, if you will, is by growing our culture, our society, we tear down a lot of wild areas. We destroy habitats. We cut down forests. And we fill in swamps to build our cities. And when you destroy the habitat of wild animals, if they can't adapt to the new habitat, they die. And what happens is we are seeing an amazing amount of animal extinctions in the last 50 years, due large part to habitat destruction. Pollution of the water and soil has not really decreased in some ways. We do have laws that regulate it, but we still have huge issues with that. And if you don't believe me, next time you want to go swimming, decide to go in the Chicago River and tell me how that works out for you. The way we use land sometimes has been short-sighted, and we'll talk about that. And we've changed once green grasslands into deserts, and we've seen immense soil erosion due to poor farming practices. And the biggest one we'll talk about is global climate change. We are changing the climate on a global scale. This used to work quite well. I wouldn't click on it now, so just ignore this. But let's talk about human impacts. The first one, desertification. The Aral Sea, right here, was at one point the fourth largest body in the world of water, after the oceans and some of the lakes. It was huge. It was larger than Lake Michigan, for instance. Okay, this is what it looked like in 1989. And this is what it looked like 2 years ago, and you can see it's almost all gone. So this was done mainly through human actions. And what happens is rivers that would flow into this were dammed up to be used to water. The water in the rivers was used to water fields that grew cotton, so cotton could be sold on the market. But the impact was if you stopped letting water flow into this body of water, it's in a very hot area, it dried up. Here's another impact. Mount Kilimanjaro is the tallest mountain in Africa. It's right on the equator. It should be very hot. But because it's so tall, it has snow on top. In fact, the snows here never melt. There are glaciers on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro at the equator. This is what it looked like in 1993. This is what it looks like in the year 2000. And you can see, I'll go back, the loss of snow. Global warming has started to melt the snow. Here's another example. Mangroves. Mangroves are basically forests on the coast of the ocean. They're kind of like a swamp. The trees in there can sustain salt water. They're very important ecosystems for animals because a lot of animals will actually have their babies in the mangrove. Fish and small amphibians and reptiles. It's a very productive environment. But it's also a place that humans use to grow shrimp. This here is in Nicaragua. You can see the mangroves, these kind of dark green areas. We started digging, not we, but they dig these huge shrimp farms. These are basically big ponds they dig to grow shrimp on a fish farm. They destroy the mangrove to do that. So you can see the difference right here. Here's probably one of the most drastic ones. This is a glacier in Alaska, 1909. This is the same view in 2004. So you can see the difference. The glacier's melted. It gets so much, you can actually see it from space. If you look right here, you can kind of see there's a line between these two areas, aren't there? The left side of your screen looks this is dry, open, bare ground, and this is forest. And this is from space, from a satellite. This is actually the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. The way that we use the environment can change in each country. Haiti had a much different law regarding the use of forests, which allowed lots of their forests to be clear cut to the ground. And as they cut away the forest, the soil erodes. And so now this area has a hard time growing any kind of animal, any kind of crop. The Dominican Republic had a much stricter law. This right here is a link I'm going to have you open on your own. It's just a time lapse. It shows how this area of southeastern China grew with cities. This area in Shenzhen is home to one of the largest increasing urban areas on the planet. The population of that area has just boomed in the last 50 years. So I highly encourage you to either click on it from the PowerPoint or go to the video lectures and find that link. Okay, let's explore these policies in a country. Kind of go over how cultural and economic actions can determine environmental reactions. And we're going to look at Colombia, which is a country in South America, between 1500, basically when the first Europeans come into today. And here is this graph. This shows you how land was used. So in the country of Colombia, right, roughly 20% of the land was used for permanent agriculture, growing crops. Roughly 80% was used as nomadic hunting and gathering in savanna. So wide open grasslands with hunter-gatherers, very little human modification, tiny little punt here for shifting agriculture. And look over time. Between 1600 and 1800, the amount of land that's used for hunting and gathering shrinks dramatically. What takes its place? Right here, grazing on natural grasslands. So this grassland that was used by hunters and gatherers, half of it is now being used for cows. Okay, and why is that? Well, if you grow cows, it's very profitable. A cattle ranch makes a lot of money. And so the wealthy elite of the colonial era are using this in large part to make money. But look what happens here. You see this shift right here beginning in 1850 through today, where you see this stay a steady amount of grazing, but what now do you see? And you see grazing on cleared lands, and they're clearing more of the forest. They're getting rid of the forest because grazing is very profitable. And so what happens is, over time, the decline in forest cover happens because those in charge of the country, the wealthiest, right, have more power to clear lands. Those who used most of the land originally had very little money and very little power and were pushed to the side. Okay. And so you can see right here, we start seeing forest clearance, and we go from 80% hunter-gatherer use to none today. All right, we're going to pause here for station identification, and we're going to come back with our next part in just a little bit.